For another exciting video lecture. I'm going to be going over Chapter 12, Survey Designs today, and I will be touching on a few things that I think are tricky at sometimes, and I think that the rest of the stuff that I kind of just go over briefly, you can figure out from reading the textbook. So why have you read the textbook and listen to me? I'm going to assume that they are equally exciting and defer to the author Cresswell. So when we think about the different goals that Cresswell has for you, right, one is defining research and describing when to use it when it's survey research. Think about the different types of surveys, identify the key characteristics, describe how to construct and use a distributed questionnaire, describe how to design and conduct an interview survey, and so on, identify potential ethical issues, list the steps in conducting survey research, and identify criteria useful for evaluating survey research. We're going to focus on really two as we go through here and slow down at those times. One is about how to construct different surveys, and then one is identifying criteria when evaluating survey research. That's going to be in a whole separate video. Survey research, as he says, it's a type of quantitative research, right? You give it to a sample or to an entire population, usually a sample, and the goal is to try to describe the population. And all of these things, fall under characteristics. All of these are parameters, as we have called them. And they can be attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or other things like income. And you can think of census data for this, right? That's a big survey that we give to the entire population of people living in the U.S., or at least head of households living in the U.S. And we're trying to actually get the whole population. You typically use survey research when you want to assess trends, how things are changing over time, to get an idea of what people think, to get an idea of how people are feeling, what people are doing, get perspectives, and you can break things down and look at different cohorts or different subgroups. So I could survey a broad group of people about what they think about the measures taken in Wisconsin under the current situation of having the coronavirus around. And I could see how millennials are different from Generation Xers and different from Generation Ys and different from the greatest generation and so on, baby boomers and whatnot. And then I can compare and see if attitudes, opinions, perspectives change, and they probably would. You can do this cross-sectionally at one time or longitudinally over multiple time points, and we'll get to that in a second. When we think about the key points that he goes over, one, how to sample from a population, two, how to collect data, how to design instruments, and then how to obtain a high response rate. And these are all really important points. The first one, sampling from a population, right? We've talked about random sampling and purposeful sampling and snowball sampling. We talked about all those different sampling procedures so far. I think we had like 10 of them, right? And then there are more. We haven't really talked about in survey research a similar idea of identifying the sampling frame and what sampling units are. And this is one of those points that I think is easily lost. The sampling frame is really just the list of people that you can actually have access to. So in other words, if I am trying to study the population of college students in Wisconsin, and I can only get the directories for Whitewater and Madison, right, that becomes my sampling frame. And the units are all the individuals who are accessible through that particular directory or those two directories. I don't have any information on people in La Crosse or Milwaukee or any of the other UW schools. And so in that way, right, my target population isn't the whole population. I want to represent the whole population, but my target population is my sampling frame, meaning the people who I actually have access to. And then the sample, I might randomly draw from those, or I might send it out to everyone and only get a certain number of responses, right? And that's my sample, the people who actually participate in the study. Not all the people who I mail the stuff to or send the email to or call and they hang up on me. It's just the people who actually participate. When we think of the types of things that can go wrong, I think this is another important point to slow down on. We have these 4 different types of error. Coverage error is something we haven't talked about before, meaning that, right, if I'm, again, trying to represent all students, our college students in Wisconsin, especially in the public universities, and I only have Whitewater and Madison, I'm leaving out a whole bunch of different campuses and 2-year universities that might actually vary considerably in whatever it is I'm asking them about. I would say that universities in larger cities like Milwaukee and Madison probably are different from those in smaller towns or smaller universities like Platteville or La Crosse or River Falls and things like that. And so you want to make sure that you have good coverage over the entire population. If I wanted to represent all college students in Wisconsin, and I just had access to Whitewater and Madison, well, now I'm also leaving out the entire private university body or population. And that's a problem for my coverage. And so if I want to reduce coverage error, I either need to reframe my research question to more directly represent who I actually have access to, or I need to get my hands on some additional information, contact information, through which I can try to get people to participate. We've talked about sampling error before, and as we said back when we were talking about statistics stuff, the best way to reduce this is by getting a large sample. It's really the only shot you have at making this smaller. And again, the closer you get to the actual population in terms of raw numbers, the smaller your sampling error is going to be. And if you actually get the entire population, your sampling error is 0, because there's no difference between the statistics you get and what the actual population parameters are. Measurement error is one that we've talked about a bit. But here it takes a little bit different, or a different kind of tact, because the measurement error comes from a lot of different places. It comes from the people who are taking it. It comes from the context that they're taking it in, and it comes from the survey questionnaire itself. And so when we think about, right, in the individual, we have people who change their mind, feel different. I ask somebody, how anxious they've been feeling in the past week. Well, that probably changes from week to week, right? Or if I ask about significant life events, that's going to change too if I go from one year to the next. When I think about the context, if I say I'm calling people, and I call them at work, well, that's going to give me probably systematic differences than if I would have reached them at home, if I would have reached them on vacation, in the morning, in the evening, right, and so on. So all that matters. When I think about the measurement tool itself, I can think that, well, if my questions aren't worded very clearly, I'm going to have people misunderstand what I'm asking. If my survey is too long, people are going to get frustrated, bored, or fatigued and not give me very good data. If I don't have scales that actually reflect what I'm trying to get out of the people who I'm asking questions to, I'm going to have mistakes there too and more error. So if I want to reduce measurement error, I need to consider all these different factors and have my materials, my instruments, and my procedures very well developed. We'll talk more about this in a little while. Finally, we have reducing non-response error. And this is the whole idea that when people participate, you are kind of getting a biased sample. And when people say no, they might be systematically different than the people who say yes. So in other words, if I'm talking about, how often people give to charities, people who hang up on me might be different and grumpier in general, right, than the people who are willing to talk. If I'm trying to measure extroversion, this is especially true, right? Extroversion, introversion, all the people who are introverts probably don't answer my email or pick up the phone. The people who are extroverts just can't wait to contact somebody. So I want to reduce this as much as possible by giving good incentives, by trying to appeal to people's sense of altruism, sometimes guilt, sometimes responsibility, right? But whatever button I push, whether it's money or obligation or honor or cooperation, whoever responds is just susceptible to that. And I have to ask myself, well, do I think that the people who don't want to be cooperative are going to give me different results if I actually get a hold of them? And that's something that you can never really get around unless it becomes a requirement. But that causes other different measurement errors because now I have a very different context for some people who are kicking and screaming, right? So these are the 4 types of errors. These are good things to keep in mind. I guarantee they will be on the exam. When we talk about the different types of survey research, he does a nice job of separating them into longitudinal and cross-sectional, right, and giving some basics. And he gives some nice examples in the text. The one thing that I think is hard to tell the difference between is the trend in the cohort. And the way that he defines and other people define it is that the trend is talking about a more generalized population, where a cohort is looking at people who have something in common. Either they were born in the same year or they went through the same experience, right? And so if I'm talking about, say, people who were in New York during 9/11, 2001, right? Or people who were actually in the World Trade Center, I might not get a hold of everybody who survived that, but I might look at, over the years, getting different people to respond to my surveys, how that group of people has changed. That's the general cohort, where the trend might be looking at people who've been through traumatic events. It's a much broader umbrella. And so you can think about the difference between these two, as the cohort is really just more specific. Otherwise, you can always flip-flop, and some people don't even make this distinction. The big difference, if we wanted to draw a line right here, is between the trend in the cohort and the panel system, where the panel, you are actually looking at the same people from year to year to year. And so in the trend in the cohort, I'm drawing different people from this population I'm interested in, and those people don't have to be the same every time I collect data over time. In the panel, the people are exactly the same, and I want to see how these people are changing. Sometimes a panel is called a cohort study, and that verbiage kind of gets mixed, but that's just the way the world is. For the purposes of this class, we're going to draw that distinction between the panel being the same people and trend and cohort being different or potentially different people. Cross-sectional research looks at one point in time, and again, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody fills out the form on the same day, the same week, or the same month, but I'm trying to ask people, I'm not trying to look at how people have changed or how things are changing over time. I'm trying to think about and answer the question, how are things right now? What's going on in terms of attitudes and behaviors right now? And this can be in communities, it can be in programs, right? I can make group comparisons, just like I can make group comparisons here. And if I'm going to take like a census, right? The initial effort is I want to see what America is like now. I can turn it into a longitudinal, right? But then I start to ask different questions. How are the needs and wealth and family size and things changing over time versus what are things like right now? And so that's the main difference between those two. One's looking for changes over time, One's looking for just a description of how things are right now. When we think about the different ways that you can get data, having participants fill things out is way faster for you, the researcher, but you get weird responses, half-completed things. You never know if they were trying or they were paying attention. Whereas if you do it, right, you have a lot more control over the quality, but it also takes way, way longer. Because for every interview you do, that might take you 30 minutes. Whereas questionnaires, you just have to click send and a whole bunch of people get them, and then you just wait for your responses. You still have to do the data analysis, but that's something you have to do on this side of the equation as well. So the next thing that I want to spend some time focusing on is the steps in designing an instrument. One of your assignments for this week is going to be making a survey, 10 to 20 questions, that covers things that any instruments that you've chosen so far don't really get at. And so you're looking for holes in the surveys or questionnaires that you're using to try to answer some other interesting questions that you might just be wondering about that aren't really contained within published instruments. So the author gives a whole bunch of things to look for. And I think that most of them are pretty straightforward. The one I think that is sometimes confusing is that questions contain negatives. Does not refer to things being stated in a negative or bad way. It just means that there is a not or a no, meaning there's a negative in the statement. And double negatives are worse than single negatives. But you want to leave all that stuff out of it because it confuses people and you can't be quite sure if they understood the question very easily. So he gives a variety of different examples. Do you support gun control, for example, right? It's unclear because of vague words, and you might ask yourself, well, what in the world is vague about that? Well, gun control means a whole bunch of different things to different people, right? So most of the pro-gun enthusiasts that I know believe in gun control. They think you should have a training program. They think you should have insurance, right? They think you should have a license. Those are all control measures, even though they are pro-gun and support the use of guns and the ability to purchase firearms and all that other stuff, right? So a much better question is about guns in schools. And even this one can be a little vague, right? Do you believe that guns do not belong in schools? For who? Security guards? For students? For teachers? Right? These are different types of questions. And so this one can be even refined a little bit further. Sometimes you might have multiple ideas. Do you believe that guns and knives do not belong in school? Right? The only way that you would say yes if you think both of them. If I think that knives are okay but guns aren't, then I say no. If I think guns are okay and knives are not, then I say no. If I think both guns and knives are not okay, I say no. Right? So I want to separate that out into different questions. Sometimes questions can be too long, and you just want to make sure you come up with a shorter version. For a couple of reasons. One, it gets confusing, and two, it takes people longer. And you want to keep these things as short as possible. Otherwise, people don't do them, as I'm sure you've done many times on the internet. You know, if you say the survey will take you 2 minutes to complete, you're much more likely than if it says it's going to take you 20 minutes to complete. So more examples. Right? Questions contain negatives. Students should not carry, right? Should students have guns in their locker? Much better, easier to understand. When we talk about jargon, right, pack of 45, well, that might mean something to everyone in the class, but a 45 refers to a specific caliber gun. And if you don't know that, you probably have no idea what's going on, right, with that question. And so we're talking about a handgun. And you might think that should students pack a 45? And no, because it's too big and so on. Everyone would see it. You want to have some other kind of gun. So it can be a little too specific there too. When we think about the different categories we have, you want to make sure two things. One, that they don't overlap, right? 1 to 2 times, 2 to 3 times. Well, I'm not sure if it's 2 where I should put this. Otherwise, everything's okay. The other thing about this too is that when you start making your intervals, if you do this, like how many times a week do you drink, or how many times a week do you experience violence, things like that, you don't want people to just have to come up with a number. Even though it's more specific, it's probably hard for people to think accurately. So that's one thing. And it makes it harder because all that data then has to be entered by hand. So it's going to take a lot longer. When you're thinking of, well, what should my categories be, right? 0 in this case makes a lot of sense. That just doesn't happen to me, right? I've never seen a student carry a gun. I never drink. I have never had a traumatic event or experienced violence, right? It just doesn't happen to me. The big question is then, for my remaining responses, how in the world do I decide that 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and then more to 4? What if 95% of my answers are more than 4 times? That becomes a wasted item in that case, because I am again trying to get a handle on whether or not people experience, and if so, how much. And so the number of intervals I have and what those intervals are require me to really look at the literature and think about, what are my expectations? I want to be able to make meaningful distinctions. So one meaningful distinction is between nothing and something, right? So that's guaranteed 2 categories. And then I'm probably thinking of occasional, frequent, daily kind of things, right? And so maybe I have 3 to 4 more categories, maybe more. But I might find through a pilot study, and again, this is when we get to the pilot study too next. This is why pilot studies are so good. You can look at initial response rates and think, am I getting my mileage out of this particular item? And if I'm not, well then I need to reevaluate my scale. Another one, unbalanced response options. Or in this case, to what extent do you feel that handguns are a problem? A great extent. Some, not very important, not a problem. These don't even make sense together, right? And so you want to make sure that the phrasing remains consistent as you go through all the different options. That's kind of a no-brainer, I think. The next one, mismatch between the question and the response, right? To what extent do you feel that handguns are a problem in your school? It doesn't make sense, right? And so you want to make sure that the options that you give them make sense. Now this, you would probably ask yourself, how in the world could somebody do that, right? Well, a lot of times these response options stay the same across questions. And then people just start writing different questions, but those responses stay the same. And so you just have to make sure that as you write new questions, or you even take questions from a different survey, that you adapt them to whatever scale you're using. Because sometimes it just kind of slips through and you're not thinking about it, and you accidentally have a question that doesn't really make much sense. The next one, respondent does not have understanding to answer the question. How often you've seen students carrying semi-automatic weapons at school, right? Versus how often have you seen students carry a rifle at school? In this case, right, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what semi-automatic weapons are, where there's less confusion about what rifles are. Now, you could have the problem here too. Rifles and shotguns are different, and people think oftentimes that any long-barreled firearm is a rifle, but rifles and shotguns actually are usually distinct from one another. Finally, not all respondents can answer the question. Branching is needed. So how many students have you seen carrying a gun at school? How many students have you seen in a gun at school? If so, how many students, right? And so in this case, if I haven't seen any, I don't have an option here. So either I could do this and have a different branch, depending how you answer question 1. This is what you do with questions 2 or 3. But in this case, if I added a 0, I would be fine here. So that would be an easier fix. So those are some nice examples he has in the text. I think it's important to spend some good time looking over those things and making sure that when you create your survey, you don't fall into any of these traps. Get rid of the jargon, keep them simple, straightforward, make sure things are consistent. Now, what we're going to be doing then is I will be kind of the pilot test, and I will be looking at things over initially. Ideally, if this class was larger, I would have everybody take your questionnaire and we could analyze some of the data. I think I still might have everybody answer your surveys, but only maybe parts, because I worry in a small class like this of identifying people's responses unless the surveys are such that nobody cares, like what's your favorite color or TV show and things like that. But nobody has a research paper like that, so it's probably not going to go that way. Anyway, pilot tests are great. It's really just going through. He gives some great information on that, and so I'll let you do that by yourself. Strategies to improve response rates. He talks about pre-notification, making sure that the people that you are asking to participate actually care about something. It's not just interesting, but some kind of motivation. I can't stress enough the importance of making it as short as possible. And then finally, incentives. Most people don't have a ton of money to throw around, but usually what people do then is you can have a chance to win $500, right? Home Depot, Target, they all do it to get you to answer response, even though you know you're competing against millions of other people who are getting receipts at Target and Home Depot. In a survey situation, if you make it known that you're only sampling, 500 people, and say you have a 1 in 500 chance of winning a $100 gift card, that will probably be more effective than just saying you have a chance to win a $100 gift card, because most people, I think, have a baseline of comparing it to everybody in America. When we talk about response bias, and we already did, right? We talked about that sometimes different people who respond, or the people who respond are different from the people who don't. And that sometimes can matter a lot, and you have to be sensitive to those things. I think he does a good job talking about it, and it's pretty easy to follow, but let me know if you have any questions on it. When you think about constructing and analyzing, I would point your attention to the sample cover letter. He kind of breaks it down really nicely. I could put that in here, talk about it, but I think I am just being redundant if I do that. So you can look at that on your own. When you talk about planning and designing an interview survey, it's very similar to a mailed out or electronic survey. The key things that you have to be careful about are experimenter effects. In other words, how you are going to impact the people who you are actually interviewing. Because if you're in a bad mood, that's going to affect people. If you're in a good mood, it's going to affect people. If for some reason they have a bias against you because of your gender or ethnicity or your age or how you talk or whatever, that could matter. And so you have to make sure that if you are the sole interviewer, you are very careful about trying to be the same with everybody. If you have teams of people, they have to go through training. Everybody needs to get on the same page. Otherwise, people can get really far apart and you can get bad data. And if you had, 10 people conducting 20 interviews each, that's a lot of wasted time. Third, take good notes. In Wisconsin, you don't need anybody's permission to record a conversation. In other states, you do. But in Wisconsin, if you want to, just keep your phone on and hit record on the little memo thing, you can get a full recording and go back and see if you missed anything, and somebody won't be worried that you're recording them. Of course, if they did find out, it would erode trust, but you're an ethical person, and I doubt that would ever become an issue. He talks about the ethical issues. I think that these are pretty easy to understand in the text, but if you do have questions, let me know. And then finally, there are the steps in conducting the research. 1, is it the best tool? 2, does it fit my hypothesis, right? 3, who am I trying to represent and who do I have access to? And then thinking about the survey design, getting instruments, using it, and so on. Kind of straightforward stuff. When we're looking at evaluating survey research, and this is something important for your methodology section for those of you who are actually using published questionnaires. That's what the next video is going to be about. There are some elements that are critical that you should be looking for. And I have some things color-coded. I would say that the things in black are pretty much no-brainers, and everybody does these things, or they don't matter that much. Like this one, I don't think is that big of a deal. Administration procedures, provide a discussion about follow-up procedures to ensure a high return rate. That can be taken care of somewhere else. I don't think it necessarily needs to be in a published article about a survey instrument. However, talking about the sample size is really important. If this is based on 30 people, it's not as good as if it's based on 3,000, especially if you're running some like static kind of analyses and so on. Critical, needs to report reliability and validity of past scores on the instrument. In other words, are you measuring the right things consistently, and does it relate to other measures of these same things? If it doesn't, it's probably not any good. And I'll be going over what that looks like in the next video. Discusses procedures for administering. I think that is a good thing because it gives you a starting point, or it can warn you. Not critical, but a good thing. And then provides a systematic procedure for analyzing the survey data, especially in some of the surveys where there are subscales. And so when you have, say, a survey that's trying to figure out your motivational or regulatory style, you might have, say, intrinsic and extrinsic, or you might have, say, more like an introjected or identified or integrated subscale. And you want to make sure that, one, it's very clear what items go to what subscales, and two, which items are reverse scaled. Which brings me to one more point that I need to make. It's very important, and it wasn't really covered in the lists of things to think about. You should have some questions stated in the opposite direction, meaning that if I am trying to get your attitudes about gun control, I might ask you questions about, do you agree or disagree with these statements? And most of them might be very pro-gun control. I should make sure that I have some anti-gun control statements in there too, to be sensitive to people who aren't reading very carefully, who are just trying to be socially desirable and circle fives on everything. And that'll cue me to some kind of problem with that data, and I should just throw that person's survey away. Shouldn't use it because it can't be trusted. If you say you strongly disagree and strongly agree with the same statement, that's a problem, right? You can't be trusted. So this brings us to your assignment. As I stated earlier, the first one is I want you to, based on what you've learned, write a 10 to 20 item survey or questionnaire that your participants would fill out or respond to, in addition to any measures that you have included. Now in this case, I want you to cover three things. One, make sure that they're tied to your research questions. Again, you don't want to be redundant and get a bunch of information you already have, so they would be things that you would be interested in. Like if you were talking about Hannah's animal-assisted therapy example, it would be along the lines of asking participants if they had received other forms of therapy in the past, what did they like, dislike about them, and so on. The second thing is that I want you to make sure that they get at things your other measures don't. Again, this is the idea that you don't want to be redundant, not just in the specific questions you're asking, but at the larger issues that you are trying to cover. And so don't have follow-ups to big sections of a published survey that's not going to give you any more real information about a different topic. I want you to kind of find those gaps and fill them in. Finally, make sure that they're well constructed based on those rules that we talked about earlier. Finally, citing resources. I want you to watch the sample video that will be posted. The link will be in the announcements regarding the evaluation of published instruments and how to cite them. And we're going to use some templates from research articles that we've already looked at. Basic things to identify are the reliability data and the validity data. So we'll get to that. And that's it. Have a great week.